Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Face the Nation. I'm Major Garrett in for Margaret Brennan. As we close out 2024, we, of course, want to look ahead to the economy, healthcare, immigration, so much more as Washington ushers in a new Congress and, importantly, a new administration. We begin with a Face the Nation tradition, our year-end Correspondents Roundtable. Joining us, Chief Legal Correspondent Jan Crawford, Congressional Correspondent Scott MacFarlane, Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa, Political Correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Senior White House and Political Correspondent Ed O'Keefe. It is great to have you all with us. Scott MacFarlane, I want to start with you. The new Congress will be sworn in this week. What position does Mike Johnson, the current Speaker of the House, find himself in seeking re-election to that position?
It's a tenuous position. It has the prospect and promise of having high drama Friday when they begin the new Congress, January 3rd, by choosing the new Speaker. One of the most underappreciated and underreported issues of the 2024 election was this incredibly narrow margin Republicans preserved in the U.S. House, even more narrow than the one that gridlocked them over the past 2 years. And, of course, the first order of business is choosing a speaker. Republicans have just 1 or 2 votes to spare on anything. That has the possibility of paralyzing things. And we saw 2 years ago, the speaker vote was it's like Gilligan's Island. It was supposed to be a 3-hour vote and ended up being a multi-arc drama with many divergent characters, not including Thurston Howell. But here's the thing. It's just the top layer of this very treacherous cake for them is picking a speaker, because what does this next speaker have to concede to win that post? We saw over the last 2 years, the prior speaker had to concede positions on the pivotal Rules Committee to some contrarian voices in the Rules Committees where bills went to die instead of to get set up for a vote. And that's why so many Democratic votes were needed for so many pivotal things, because the Rules Committee was jammed up by contrarians. That could happen again. Robert
Costa, I want to turn to you, because if he were so inclined, President-elect Trump could clarify his preference here, and that would send an important signal to those Republicans in the House majority to be still on the fence about this. Yet he remains conspicuously silent.
That decision is reflective of the dynamic right now down at Mar-a-Lago, the president's retreat in Florida. There is high drama, as Scott reports, on Capitol Hill. But in Trump's inner circle, it's almost like the low-key second season of a TV show. That's how it's been described to me by allies of President-elect Trump. He's being guided by Susie Wiles, his incoming chief of staff. And she's created, I'm told, this atmosphere of calm when it comes to some of the nominees, the process, laying out the agenda for next year. Top of the agenda, tax cuts, trying to expand those Trump tax cuts from 2017. Of course, mass deportations, also part of Trump's plan, a border bill as well. And you do have controversial nominees in Kash Patel for the FBI, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for Health and Human Services, among others. But at its core, you have a president-elect who's now comfortable with power, comfortable with the people around him. This is so different, Major, than what we saw in 2016 when we were covering that transition period. It had this theatrical element, Trump welcoming people to Bedminster for these showy appearances and interviews. Now we rarely see the president-elect. He's firing off missives at times on Truth Social, his platform, but he's often behind the scenes getting ready for 2025 because he's been here before. He knows what he wants to do.
Ed O'Keefe, President Biden remains president of the United States, though some Americans might have to be reminded of that fact.
Yeah.
What is ahead for the president in the waning days of his presidency in terms of travel and possible pardons?
Well, he is taking one final foreign trip, and it was one that those of us who've followed him a long time, anticipated might happen, and that is a trip to the Vatican to see the Pope and then to see the Italian leadership as well. They've been in far closer contact than I think many people appreciate, because the Pope, like the president, shares a lot of the concerns about the state of the world, about what's going on in Ukraine and Gaza.
Conflict, climate change.
Absolutely, yeah, and state of democracy, and just general concern for social justice, which
refugee flows.
Yeah, exactly. And so that will be a critical political meeting, but also a real personal capstone for the second Catholic president. And it speaks as well to one of the things he's been focused on over the last several weeks and will continue to be. We're still waiting to hear more about, for example, pardons and clemency. Will there be more of those? And will they be for the everyman, or will they be for notable political figures like, for example, Jesse Jackson Jr., the former congressman from Illinois, or others who've ended up in the legal system and maybe are well known and are now appealing for some kind of leniency or forgiveness? And so those 37 death row clemencies that we saw before Christmas, a good example of what's to come and what he's eager to do, and also a good example of what little he can do, because of course Congress has no interest in working with him. They can't even really sort out what to do with themselves, but so he's using the executive privileges that he has in these waning weeks.
Jan, as you know better than anyone at this table, this last year was a clash of law and politics unlike anything we have seen in our modern American history. The judicial system in our country, according to Gallup, 35% confidence, 20% below our peer countries, other free market democracies. How much of that is a reflection of this clash, the Supreme Court, or just a sense that our judicial system has become, in the words of someone we've all come to know, two-tiered?
That's a hard question to answer because I think you've got
the easiest ones,
but I'm going to try, Major, because I think you've got to look past just this past year and go further back. I think it really started and took off in the wake of the Dobbs decision. The court's ruling that overturned Roe versus Wade. The outrage over that decision was so extreme that you saw, I think, a quite calculated effort to undermine the legitimacy of the Supreme Court by Democrats, Senate Democrats, for example, hearings, stories about scandals, some of which were pretty overblown, to say the least. So that has an impact on public opinion. The public starts to believe that this court is corrupt, that this is, it's on the take, none of which is true. I mean, this is still a court. You may disagree with their decisions. It's a very conservative court. It is not a corrupt court. These are 9 justices who have very different views on how to interpret the Constitution, who are kind of in this titanic struggle over law, not politics. Even the immunity decision. I mean, that decision was so misreported to say that the court was going to save Trump from a criminal trial. No, it wasn't. That was never the decision. In fact, that decision is going to help protect Joe Biden from any future prosecution by Donald Trump if he wanted to do that. So, when we look at public opinion polls, sure, the court's taken a hit, but that's true over the years. The court often takes a hit, so do other institutions. And the court's opinion, court's public opinion remains much higher than our other institutions, including the White House, Congress, and by far the news media.
Congress at 17%, according to Gallup. Caitlin, Jan mentioned the Dobbs decision. One of the things that roiled through the political calendar year of 2024 was how important, how impactful would that decision be on turnout and the ultimate outcome of the election? But as you traveled the country, you kept telling us, yes, it's an important issue, but there are other things on the minds of women voters in this country.
Yeah, we always say that voters have the capacity to think about a lot of different things at once. And we saw in the wake of that decision in the midterms, that was top of mind for people. It was the first way to kind of exercise their views across the country on this issue. But this time around, voters had different ways to express their feelings about the Dobbs decision. Many of them had ballot measures in their states, a couple of those states being battleground states, that they could vote for codifying abortion rights into their state law and also vote for Donald Trump because they believed in his views on the economy, on immigration, or at least that he could, solve some of their concerns about them. And as I spoke to women across the country, as we all spent the whole year talking to voters and really listening to voters, a lot of women talked to me about how concerned they were about safety, about the economy, a lot of them responsible for their families' budgets, paying the bills, going to the grocery store, these kinds of fundamental things. And also, it was kind of a reminder that we've been treating women as kind of a monolithic group in the wake of Dobbs. And this election showed that it's not as such, that they do care a lot about safety, the economy. Those were overarching issues. But they also do care about women's rights, abortion rights, but they just had other avenues to express that. And that's really what helped. And Donald Trump also, modified his positions, at least to satisfy some of those voters, at least that I spoke to.
Robert, Caitlin brought up women's concerns about security that flows through immigration. I wonder what your perspective is on this online feud that's gone on for the last 3 or 4 days between parts of the MAGA universe over H-1B visas, which are essentially visas set aside for high-skilled laborers. Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, and nominally President-elect Trump on the side of that, hard-right nativist parts of the MAGA movement using expletives on social media, typically reserved for their political foes, not for those in the MAGA tent, assailing one another. What do you make of all of that?
The coalition that lifted Donald Trump back to power included Silicon Valley executives. Elon Musk, Trump Inner Circle members say, deserves a lot of credit for pouring a lot of money in the final months into the campaign. But at the end of the day, this was a campaign where so many voters at rally after rally we covered were holding up signs that said mass deportations now. The message was obvious. It was in your face. And for the idea that President-elect Trump's going to back away from his immigration position because of some whisper in his ear from a Silicon Valley billionaire, it's just not happening based on my reporting.
And Scott, very quickly, do you think that, we've got about 30 seconds before we need to go to break, how much do you think that will be a part of the early congressional conversation?
I think this battle over the debt limit, which Elon Musk weighed in on, is going to be the first throwdown of 2025 and impact the first year of Trump's term, because they're going to need Democratic votes to raise the debt ceiling. That won't satisfy the Elon Musks of the world. I'm not sure how Trump circumvents Democratic concessions for the debt ceiling.
When we come back, you know it, you love it. Predictions, biggest story, things that were undercovered with our outstanding correspondents panel. We'll be back in just one moment. Welcome back to Face the Nation, our Correspondents Roundtable. Predictions, Caitlin Huey-Burns.
I think the biggest story to watch this coming year is how the president-elect, when he becomes president, handles immigration. We talk a lot about how the economy was the overarching theme of this election. Immigration is what Trump made his not only closing argument on, but his entire campaign was really rooted in immigration. So what this looks like, we saw in our polling, majority support for mass deportations. What does that actually look like? And how do they handle that once we see what that looks like on television, how they have people explaining their policy, and what those stories look like because of that, and whether the base is satisfied and whether the general public gets what they voted for on that.
Jan, 2025 prediction.
I'll go back to the court. I think that Donald Trump will probably get his fourth nomination to the Supreme Court either this year or maybe next year.
Because someone retires.
Justice Sam Alito.
Justice Sam Alito.
He was nominated, took the bench in 2006 after nearly 2 decades on the court.
Robert Costa.
Well, most importantly, Marcus Freeman and the Fighting Irish will win the Sugar Bowl on January 1st.
Now, this is normally my prediction with Alabama.
I'm stepping into your territory.
You know,
but
I'm happy to give it to you.
Governing by crisis in 2025. Ed, when we first met over a decade ago, we were covering crisis on Capitol Hill. Sure. Crisis persists. Such a handful, and Caitlin Huey-Burns as well, and Scott was there as well. And look, they only have a handful of seats in the House for the Republican majority. They can only do so much. As Scott said, debt limit battle on the horizon, spending fights. Deja vu, that culture of crisis governing to the brink of discussions, it's here again.
Ed O'Keefe.
I'll make the firmer prediction that based on all that chaos, Speaker Johnson won't be Speaker by the end of 2025. Did that a few years ago on Paul Ryan and it worked. So watch out, Speaker Johnson. Nothing
Be
personal,
careful,
but just
Speaker
look
Johnson.
at what faces him. The other one, real quick: Washington Commanders will get a stadium here in the District of Columbia because that congressional vote that authorized land
happened right before Congress adjourned.
It sure did. And it was a great surprise at D.C. It'll happen this year.
Scott MacFarlane.
Long before the next election, there will be some people departing Washington voluntarily. This is a challenging environment to be an elected official. They're getting thousands of threats a year on their lives, on their families. The travel's exhausting, and we're coming into a relatively polarizing moment with Trump coming back into office. You're going to see a lot of retirements in odd-numbered years, including 2025.
I think that's one reason why you're going to see Justice Alito step down.
One of the things we
threats,
also do in the
threats.
year-end Correspondents Roundtable is dig into what was undercovered or underreported. Jan?
Undercovered, underreported. That would be, to me, Joe Biden's obvious cognitive decline that became undeniable in the televised debate.
At the presidential debate with Donald Trump.
Unquestioned. And, you know, it's starting to emerge now that his advisors kind of managed his limitations. It's been reported in the Wall Street Journal for 4 years. And yet he insisted that he could still run for president. We should have much more forcefully questioned whether he was fit for office for another 4 years, which could have led to a primary for the Democrats. It could have changed the scope of the entire election. Yet still, incredibly, we read in the Washington Post that his advisors are saying that he regrets that he dropped out of the race. You know, that he thinks he could have beaten Trump. And I think that is either delusional or they're gaslighting
President
American
Biden
people.
has said repeatedly he was sick during the debate June 27th in Atlanta, and he's always been fine, and he leaves fine. That is his position, the position of many of his top aides as well, even though there is that reporting.
50
Robert
people
Costa.
in a journal interview.
The biggest story that's underreported, the battle for working voters across the country. I spent a lot of time this year with Sean Fain, the head of the UAW. That's the battle of the future. Who's going to win over that person who's aligned with labor, or the industrial worker in this country? Is it going to be the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? It remains a key story, deserves more attention.
Caitlin Huey-Burns.
I mentioned how we covered women voters, but also I think there is an aspect to which we underestimated, or perhaps the public underestimated, how Trump's personality wasn't as much of a burden to him. And in some ways, it turned out to be a benefit with low propensity voters. And talking to the Trump campaign throughout the cycle and reporting on it, they were making this bet that if he leaned into his personality and made no qualms about it, made no apologies for about it, that would kind of speak to this authenticity factor, this premium that low propensity voters, those not inclined to participate in elections, might be inclined towards. It was a big bet. It paid off. And it will remain, the biggest question I have is whether Republicans can replicate any of that, because so much of their political wins this year are unique to Donald Trump himself.
Scott MacFarlane, underreported.
The scope and size and political impact of these forthcoming January 6 pardons. Trump has never specified if it's everybody or just some people. Will it include people who gassed and beat police officers with baseball bats, or will it just be those who pleaded guilty to misdemeanors? He's never been pressed to specify if it's all or some, and what's the political impact? Did his voters really want that? Does he gain political capital or lose it if he pardons everyone?
Ed O'Keefe.
Once again, we don't cover the Western Hemisphere enough, and why it is that people come from the far reaches of South America.
What is the
and across
gravitational pull of the United States
Exactly.
in those particular countries?
And it's going to be more critical than ever in the coming year that we continue to explore and explain why it is they continue to do so, despite the threats of being sent back. And watch also the cooperation between a lot of those countries, especially in Central America, with the United States, and the intrigue they have over the first Latino Secretary of State, the most senior Latino ever to serve in an administration and in the presidential line of succession, Marco Rubio. I heard within days of the election from Latin American governments quite eager to get on the good side of Marco Rubio, because they are thrilled to know there will be more attention paid to the hemisphere, as there should be.
And there will be attention paid in terms of accepting those this administration incoming
Sends back.
intends to deport.
Yeah, that because they understand that's the gateway.
To better relations with this
Yeah,
administration.
that if you start with that and, ensure that they're being treated fairly on their way back, that they'll probably end up taking them. No formal agreements yet, but they're willing to have the conversation.
No better way to close out a calendar year than to have the Correspondents Roundtable here at Face the Nation. It's been my honor and privilege to have you all here. Ed O'Keefe, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Scott MacFarlane, Robert Costa, Jan Crawford, my thanks to all of you.